You know what terrifies me? It's not the crash itself, it's watching intelligent people clutch their gold and silver, believing they're safe, while the system quietly rewrites every rule they're counting on. In the next few minutes, I'm going to walk you through these brutal truths about precious metals protection that Wall Street won't tell you, the gaps in conventional wisdom that separate the 0.1% who preserve wealth from the 99.9% who watch it vanish. And if you stay with me until the end, you'll discover exactly how to structure real protection that works when governments panic and markets freeze, not just on paper during calm times. So before we dive in, do me a favor, hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't it already, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because what I'm about to share comes from watching 7 decades of crisis unfold, and you deserve to learn from those hard lessons before you need them. Here's what most investors get catastrophically wrong about crisis protection. Listen, I've been studying financial disaster since the 1950s, and I need to tell you something that's going to make you uncomfortable. Most people who own gold and silver today are walking around with a false sense of security that's more dangerous than having no protection at all. They think they've solved the crisis problem by buying some coins or an ETF, and they sleep better at night believing they're prepared. They're not. And that comfortable delusion is exactly what destroys wealth when the system comes under real pressure. Here's what I learned over 70 years of watching markets collapse, currencies fail, and governments intervene. Owning the asset is not the same as being protected by the asset. That distinction sounds subtle, but it's the difference between preservation and devastation. You see, most investors confuse price appreciation with actual protection. They watch gold climb during uncertainty and think, see, it's working. But protection isn't about watching numbers go up on a screen. It's about maintaining your purchasing power and your access when everything around you is breaking down. Those are two very different things. Let me walk you through why 99.9% get this wrong. First, they buy at the wrong time. They wait until fear is already widespread, until everyone's talking about crisis, until prices have already moved significantly. Then they jump in, paying elevated premiums driven by emotion rather than strategy. I've watched this pattern repeat in every single crisis cycle. 1973, 1987, 2000, 2008. People prepare after the warning signs, not before them. And that timing mistake alone sets them up for failure because they enter positions when risk is high and patience is required, but they have neither the cushion nor the temperament to endure volatility. Second, and this is critical, they completely misunderstand what they actually own. Someone tells them gold is safe, so they buy a gold ETF through their brokerage account. They look at their statement, see the position, and feel secure. But what do they really own? They own a claim on gold, not the gold itself. They own a contractual promise from an institution that depends on computers, clearinghouses, counterparties, and most importantly, rules that only work when the system is functioning normally. The moment genuine systemic stress hits, I mean real stress, not a market correction, but a crisis that threatens the financial architecture itself, those claims get tested in ways most people never anticipated. You want to know how I know this? Because I studied what happened in the 1930s extensively. I wasn't there, obviously. I was born in 1924, but I spent years understanding that period because it reveals what governments do when their backs are against the wall. In 1933, Executive Order 6102 forced Americans to surrender their gold to the Federal Reserve. Citizens were required to exchange their gold for paper dollars at $20.67 per ounce. Then, after the government collected the gold, they revalued it to $35 per ounce. Think about that. The government forced people to sell low, then immediately marked up the value. That wasn't theft in the legal sense, it was policy, but the effect was the same: wealth transfer from citizens to the state. Now, most people hear that story and think, well, that was the Great Depression, that was extreme, that won't happen again. Really? Let me ask you this: if governments were willing to confiscate gold when debt and economic pressure were severe, in the 1930s. What makes you think they won't intervene again when the next crisis hits and debt levels are multiples higher than they were back then? The tools might look different. Maybe they don't physically confiscate your coins, but capital controls, emergency taxes, restrictions on movement, forced reporting requirements, those are all modern equivalents that achieve the same result, limiting your access and your flexibility exactly when you need it most. Here's another painful truth most investors ignore. Inflation protection is not automatic. Yes, gold typically rises during inflationary periods. But if inflation is running at 15% per year and gold only appreciates 10%, you're still losing purchasing power in real terms. Meanwhile, if the government imposes a windfall tax on gold profits, and believe me, they've discussed this before, your nominal gains get eroded further. So you're watching the price go up, feeling like you're winning, while silently your real wealth is shrinking. That's the illusion that traps people. And then there's the liquidity trap. You know what's worthless? An asset you can't access or convert when you need it. I watched this play out in multiple international crises. In Cyprus in 2013, the government froze bank accounts overnight. People had money on paper, but they couldn't get to it. Now imagine that scenario, but with gold held in a digital account or pooled storage program managed by an institution facing liquidity pressure. You log in, and the system tells you redemptions are temporarily suspended, or they offer you a cash settlement instead of physical delivery. Or they tell you there's a 6-month waiting period. Suddenly your protection becomes a promise you can't enforce. The reason 99.9% lose isn't because gold and silver fail as assets. They don't. They've preserved wealth for thousands of years across every civilization. The reason people lose is because they treat these assets like magic talismans instead of tools that require understanding, structure, and discipline. They don't ask the hard questions. Where is it stored? Who controls access? What happens if the institution fails? Can I move it if I need to? What are the legal restrictions in a crisis scenario? Without those answers, you're not protected. You're just hopeful. And hope is not a strategy when your financial survival is at stake. Why the rules you're counting on will change overnight and what that means for your wealth now. I want to take you deeper into something most investors never consider until it's too late, the certainty that rules change during crisis. And I don't mean subtle policy adjustments. I mean the fundamental frameworks you're relying on for protection get rewritten, often overnight, and usually without your consent or even advanced warning. This is where the real danger lives. And it's precisely why most people's protection strategies collapse even when they own the right assets. Let me tell you about Bretton Woods. In 1944, world leaders established a system where currencies were tied to the US dollar, and the dollar was tied to gold at $35 per ounce. That system created stability for decades. Investors and governments worldwide structured their entire financial planning around that fixed relationship. Then, on August 15, 1971, President Nixon unilaterally closed the gold window. Overnight, the rules that governed international finance for 27 years, gone. No vote, no negotiation, just a television announcement. And everyone holding dollars or dollar-denominated assets had to adjust to a completely new reality. I bring this up because it perfectly illustrates how quickly foundational assumptions can evaporate. People say, well, I'm protected because I own gold. Okay, but protected under what rules? The rules that exist today. What happens when those rules change? And make no mistake, they will change when the next crisis hits. Because that's what governments do when survival is threatened. They don't prioritize your property rights or investment returns. They prioritize systemic stability and their own continuity of power. Everything else is negotiable. Think about the starting point we're in right now as of 2023. Global debt, government, corporate, household, has reached levels never seen in human history. Central banks spent the last 15 years suppressing interest rates and printing money to manage every economic slowdown. That worked for a while, but now they're trapped. If they raise rates significantly, the debt service costs alone could collapse governments and banking systems. If they keep printing money, inflation spirals out of control and destroys currency value. There's no clean exit anymore, only choices between different types of pain. When central banks are trapped like this, they become dangerous. Not malicious necessarily, but desperate. And desperate institutions do radical things. They implement capital controls to prevent money from leaving the country. They impose wealth taxes to fund government operations. They mandate financial repression, where they force institutional investors to buy government bonds at below market rates. They change tax laws retroactively. They alter property rights through emergency powers. All of this has happened before in various countries during various crises, and there's no reason to believe it won't happen again. Now, here's the part that terrifies me. Most investors are structuring their protection as if the current rules are permanent. They're not asking, what if they change the definition of reportable assets? What if they impose restrictions on precious metals transactions? What if they create a two-tier pricing system where paper gold trades at one price and physical gold is restricted? These aren't paranoid fantasies. These are the kinds of measures governments have actually implemented when they felt cornered. Let me share something from my own experience watching markets. In the 1970s, I watched inflation ravage purchasing power, while the government simultaneously imposed price controls, wage controls, and even tried to control the gold market through various interventions. The official story was that these measures would help stabilize the economy. The actual result was distortion, shortages, and wealth destruction for anyone who didn't understand the game being played. The people who protected themselves weren't the ones who simply owned gold. They were the ones who owned it in the right form, held it in the right jurisdiction, and understood that government policy was a bigger risk than market volatility. You need to understand something fundamental about how crises unfold. The initial shock, the market crash, the bank failure, the currency collapse, that's just the beginning. The real wealth destruction happens during the response phase when policymakers scramble to contain the damage and implement emergency measures. That's when liquidity disappears. That's when access gets restricted. That's when investors discover that what they thought they owned isn't actually available to them in the way they expected. I'll give you a modern example. During the 2008 financial crisis, money market funds, instruments that were supposed to be completely safe and liquid, broke the buck. The Treasury Department had to step in with emergency guarantees. People who thought they could access their cash instantly found themselves frozen out temporarily. Now, that was eventually resolved, but it reveals the fragility. If something as basic as a money market fund can freeze during stress, what makes you think more complex structures around gold and silver won't face similar or worse problems? Here's the question you should be asking yourself. If a real crisis hits and everyone simultaneously tries to convert paper claims into physical assets, what happens? The system simply cannot deliver. It was never designed. These structures work based on the assumption that most people won't actually demand delivery at the same time. But in a crisis, that assumption breaks. And when it breaks, you get force majeure clauses, cash settlements, delivery delays, and ultimately rule changes that favor institutions over individuals. The scariest part, most of this won't even feel like outright confiscation. It'll be framed as necessary regulation, temporary emergency measures, or fairness requirements. We need to know who owns precious metals for tax compliance. We need to restrict movement to prevent capital flight. We need to impose reporting requirements to combat money laundering. Each measure will sound reasonable in isolation, but the cumulative effect will be to limit your freedom, access, and control over assets you thought were private and secure. The only way to actually protect yourself, and why most people will ignore this until it's too late. So here's what you need to understand going forward, and I'm telling you this as someone who spent 70 years watching smart people make the same mistakes over and over. Real protection is not a product you buy. It's a strategy you build. And that strategy must account for multiple dimensions of risk simultaneously, not just market risk, but political risk, legal risk, access risk, and counterparty risk. Most people fail because they treat protection like a transaction rather than a system. Let me be blunt. If all you do is buy some gold coins and stick them in a safe, you're better off than most people, but you're not truly protected. If you only own paper gold through an ETF, you're exposed in ways you probably don't fully understand. If you have all your precious metals in one location under one legal jurisdiction, you're concentrated in ways that create vulnerability. Real protection requires diversification not just across assets, but across structures, jurisdictions, and forms of ownership. Here's what that actually looks like in practice. First, you need physical metal that you personally control, not held by a bank, not in a pooled storage program, not in an unallocated account. Physical gold and silver coins or bars that exist outside the digital financial system that don't depend on anyone's promise, that you can access without permission from an institution. This is your foundation, your crisis insurance. It won't make you rich, but it will preserve purchasing power when paper currencies fail. And make no mistake, paper currencies always fail eventually. It's not a question of if, but when and how fast. But here's the critical part most people miss. You also need liquidity and flexibility. Physical metal is excellent for long-term preservation, but it's not liquid in the same way cash or marketable securities are. So you need assets across the spectrum. Some physical metal for ultimate security, some liquid assets for near-term needs, some productive assets that generate income even during inflation. This isn't about betting on one outcome. It's about maintaining function regardless of which crisis scenario unfolds. Second, you need geographic diversification. If all your protection is held in one country, you're exposed to that country's specific policy risks. International storage, foreign bank accounts, assets held in stable jurisdictions with strong property rights. These create optionality. If capital controls get imposed in your home country, having assets outside those controls provides freedom. I'm not talking about tax evasion. I'm talking about legal, reported structures that simply exist outside a single jurisdiction's control. Third, you need to understand timing and psychology. The absolute worst time to build protection is during a crisis. That's when premiums are highest, availability is lowest, and emotional decision-making is strongest. Real protection is built during calm periods when nobody's paying attention, when prices are reasonable, when you have time to think clearly. The people who succeed are the ones who act early before fear spreads, before everyone else realizes they need the same assets. Now, I know what some of you are thinking, Charlie. This sounds complicated. Can I just buy a gold ETF and call it a day? Sure, you can. But understand what you're doing. You're choosing convenience over security. You're prioritizing ease of transaction over control. And in normal times, that might work fine. But we're not talking about normal times. We're talking about crisis scenarios where convenience becomes a liability and control becomes survival. Let me share something personal. Over my career, I made plenty of mistakes, but one principle that served me incredibly well was this: understand what you own, why you own it, and what could go wrong. That sounds simple, but most investors never actually do it. They buy something because everyone else is buying it, or because a financial advisor recommended it, or because it sounds safe. They don't read the fine print. They don't ask the hard questions. They don't stress test their assumptions. And then when crisis hits, they're shocked to discover the protection they thought they had was an illusion. You want to know the real secret? It's not prediction, it's preparation. I never tried to predict exactly when crises would happen or precisely how they'd unfold. What I did was structure things so that I could function regardless of the outcome. Multiple layers of protection, different asset types, various forms of ownership, strategies that didn't depend on everything going perfectly. That's what real wealth preservation looks like. It's not exciting, it's not sexy, but it works. Here's the final thing I need you to understand. Time is running out to prepare thoughtfully. We're not in the early stages of this debt cycle anymore. We're in the late stages. Central banks have already used most of their conventional tools. Governments are already heavily indebted. The next shock, whenever it comes, will force desperate responses. And desperate responses mean rule changes, interventions, and measures that look unthinkable today but become necessary tomorrow. The 0.1% who will preserve wealth through the next crisis are already preparing. They're not waiting for permission or perfect information. They're building redundancy into their strategies right now. They're diversifying across physical and paper, domestic and international, liquid and illiquid. They're educating themselves on history, on policy tools, on what governments actually do when cornered. They're taking responsibility for their own protection instead of hoping institutions will take care of them. And here's what separates them from everyone else. They're not doing this out of fear. They're doing it out of respect for reality. They understand that markets cycle, that governments intervene, that currencies fail, and that the only reliable protection comes from strategies that account for those truths. They've accepted that the comfortable assumptions most people cling to are dangerous, and they've chosen clarity over comfort. So let me leave you with this. You have a choice right now. You can continue believing that simply owning some gold or silver automatically protects you. You can assume the rules will stay the same and that institutions will honor their promises when crisis hits. You can wait until fear is widespread and everyone else is scrambling for the same assets you need. Or you can take responsibility for building real protection right now while there's still time, while prices are reasonable, while you can think clearly and act deliberately. The next crisis is coming, not because I'm predicting it, but because that's how debt cycles work. When it arrives, 99.9% will lose wealth despite owning precious metals because they misunderstood how protection actually works. They'll own the right assets in the wrong form, through the wrong structures, with the wrong assumptions. Don't be part of that 99.9%. Build real protection. Do it now and do it right. Now, if this changed how you think about crisis preparation, hit that like button and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below telling me what aspects of protection you're implementing first, because the people who act on knowledge are the ones who actually benefit from it. Subscribe if you want more straight talk about wealth preservation, because the truth isn't always comfortable, but it's always valuable. Your financial future depends on the decisions you make today before crisis forces those decisions on you. Don't wait. Start building real protection now.